um, are what does it mean when we talk about ethics, standards, professional versus personal employee practices, what are the management tools that we have available to us, and the importance of having clear personnel policy and procedures, um, accurate and current position descriptions, and talking about employment contracts. So as many of you know, within the field of the kind of work that we do with domestic violence and sexual assault programs, we don't really have a formal written standard of professional ethics or professional guidelines that we follow. And so many of us who have been doing human resource work for many years, over time have developed and have chosen to use as guidelines other fields of work and their standards. And in my work, over the past 25 years, the professional standards that come closest to what I do are the social work standards. So there is a citation there where you can go and look up the social work standards. One of the things I like about those standards is they publish what are called practice perspectives. So anytime you have a set of professional standards for your profession, of which I'm going to refer to the domestic violence, anti-violence field, as a field of work, there are guidelines that you can follow in terms of deciding how you're going to relate to people, how you're going to treat clients, how you're going to set up your program guidelines, and so forth. So there's nothing really in writing except guidelines. So I think one of the things that would be helpful for tribal programs, for tribal organizations, for coalitions, for DV programs and shelters, is to develop a set of our own practice perspectives, our own best practices that are culturally relevant and you know, based on traditions, because there is no such thing as we're operating now. So over time, I think based on the work that we've been doing for the past 30 years, that there's enough institutional knowledge, individual knowledge out there that we could come together and actually publish some standards. We do have certain other points of reference that we operate off of, and we're going to talk about those a little bit better, those external rules and guidelines that guide us in our work. So here at WomenSpirit, we've developed sort of a checklist for components of a culturally respective response. And this is mainly in regard to occupations and organizations that serve a specific clientele. And more or less around the social service field. So one of the items should be that services are accessible. That means that services are available and easy to get to, not a formidable amount of paperwork, and few blocks to services, if any. Another item that should be included in your programming should be that your services are accountable, which means that someone determines if they're responsible, explainable, and answerable. So there's some kind of evaluation process included in developing a culturally respectful response. Services should be non-racist and non-discriminatory, not biased, meaning that your program doesn't treat people differently, and it doesn't decide who is eligible for services based on some kind of perception, either of who they are or a judgment, other kind of judgment. That your program and services are respectful and that they're delivered in a manner that is differential, dutiful, and humble. That services are collaborative, cooperative, joint services. We talk about developing coordinated community responses, that services somehow are tied to other services offered in your community. That services and programs are flexible. That means they have an ability to bend without breaking and the ability to adapt. So we don't want to create services, processes, policies, and procedures that can't be changed, that they're set in stone. And that your services and programs are trustworthy, meaning they're dependable, honest, capable, and constant. So those are just some of the standards of service delivery that comes with our territory and providing our services. So today we're going to talk a little bit about boundaries and ethics in the workplace. And the question is, why do we need to set clear boundaries? For one thing, it reduces the risk of exploitation up the chain of command and down the chain of command. And we're going to talk about all the ways that these boundaries are found in our workplace documents. Setting clear boundaries reduces anxiety as rules and roles are clear. And this one we're going to talk more about later, but often in Indian country we have many roles and we wear many hats. And it does lead to conflicts of interest and unclear boundaries. In general, setting clear boundaries increases the well-being of the organization. Provides role models for program members, coalition members, by program or coalition staff. And so by having boundaries and learning how to respect each other's territory and responsibilities as defined by their job descriptions, then we just provide good communication between each other and a show of that respect that is highly needed in workplaces. Setting clear boundaries reduces power struggles within the organization. I think we can all know what power struggles are, and if everybody is operating within their boundaries, then those should be fairly minimal. So when we talk about boundaries, what are we talking about? Why be clear about who does what, when, and where, and under what circumstances? And when would this agreement not apply? So we have boundaries because they help us develop a sense of personal identity and self-definition that has consistency and cohesion over time. Once established, boundaries remain constant regardless of emotional ups and downs or external pressures. And this concept of boundaries is the framework within which the supervisor and staff relationship occurs. And so that means all the way down from the highest executive office down to a coordinator, down to a manager, whatever your management setup is. And it provides an objective system of limit setting. The line between the self of the supervisor and the self of the staff, and it clarifies the personal versus professional dilemmas that we might get into. So who is responsible for negotiating boundaries in the workplace? Where does that start? And I'm lumping together all of us into one little pot here. I'm not making any kind of differentiation between a tribal program or a tribal coalition or a tribal workplace of any kind. We all should be following, you know, the highest standards of behavior, ethics, and so on that we can. So I'm kind of talking in generalities. So it falls on the manager to act in the best interest of the staff, and that means at whatever level you're operating at. In this case, the manager could be taken out and replaced with the executive director, or could be taken out and replaced with the director, or could be taken out and replaced with the coordinator. So whatever that office is, that position is, it's the duty of the manager to act in the best interest of the staff. The manager is ultimately responsible for managing boundary issues between themselves and staff. But staff is also responsible for their actions and behaviors and communication to the program or coalition members. So here is, we have a hierarchy, a trickle-down effect of boundaries. So it goes from the highest level to mid-management down to frontline staff. Everybody's responsible for some form of monitoring their behaviors and their relationships. So management has few tools that they can use to do this sort of personnel management. But the most important ones are the personnel policy and procedures, the job description, and the employment contract. So if you're a tribal program and you don't have any of these in place, I'd say you're really operating at a deficit. If you're a program that operates under the umbrella of a tribe, you can still have your program policy and procedures, and you really need those. Some of the employment requirements are going to probably be under the tribe's employment policy and procedures, and you'll have to refer back to that. But every program and every employee, every person who gets a paycheck should be aware of the agency policies and procedures, and have a current and updated job description that's reflective of what they do currently, and should have received some kind of an employment contract letter upon hire. So some of the questions that may arise out of some boundary issues can be found within the language of those three employment documents. So I've been doing programming and supervising staff for over 25 years. And I think one of the areas that often comes um, into play when you're setting boundaries and establishing workplace mores and looking at the internal and external cultures of your organization is where and how do personal issues impact the work. So here are some of those issues broken down, and certainly you may be able to think of others that you've come into contact while you're doing your managing of staff. Some of the personal issues that may impact performance by those you supervise are distracted at work by home issues, disruptive to others needing to talk about personal business, excessively absent or ill, lack of social skills in a business setting, at organizational or department meetings, acting inappropriately when meeting new associates, uncomfortably loud or needs to be the center of attention, and ignores organizational directives. So I added that last one, ignores directives, because that's a personal choice. So that becomes a personal issue when you have employees that choose not to adhere to internal organizational standards. On the professional side, it's the job of management to provide those that we supervise with proper equipment, such as a proper computer, access to technology, access to the internet, information necessary to be successful at the job. Other areas that fall under the professional performance issues is that an employee has not received proper training or instruction on their job, does not understand the informal and formal culture of the organization, and does not abide by it. And so with most dilemmas that I've come across, performance issues can be either one of two things. They can either fall under the personal category, or they can fall under the professional category. If it falls under the personal category, it's the responsibility of the staff person to remedy those situations. And if it falls under the professional side of the equation, then it's up to your supervisors and managers to remedy those items. So when we talk about motivation, when we talk about an employee choosing not to do something, or choosing not to improve performance, we want to look at the motivation. Intrinsic motivation comes from within. You have a job and a profession that you value and is reflective of your inner core beliefs and practices, and you consider it a passion of yours to be doing this job, or a calling to be doing this job. If your motivation is from without, it's called extrinsic, and you're doing the job because of things like it's a paycheck, or it's the only job available. It's really the opposite of doing the work because it's a passion of yours. The type of motivation an employee has at work really does affect their ability to follow through and do good work for the organization. So it's one of those questions that a supervisor wants to observe or ask. Why, and maybe you could ask it at a hiring interview, why do you want this job? And it will tell you a lot about possibly the quality of the work that's going to come from the employee. So let's talk about a little bit about professionalism. You know, I mentioned that we've been doing this work now for 30 years in the domestic violence and sexual assault field. And so it has become a profession over the years. There is money attached to doing the work. You know, when the first advocates came to be, they were unpaid, they were volunteers. You know, they may or may not have been survivors themselves. They were church women. They were wealthy women who didn't need to work. But over the years, we've seen that domestic violence and sexual assault organizations have become somewhat of a business. And now most of our contracts and our agreements in exchange for money require college degrees and so on and so forth, and requires us to keep track of our training and so on. So we have become a profession. So talking again about the need for boundaries, just think about your own workplace and those who you supervise and work with. And think of some examples of some boundaries that others have crossed. And we're going to talk a little bit about, hopefully brainstorm, how we can handle boundary violations. And so there's an inherent power imbalance between staff and management. And management is perceived as having the power and control, and actually does have the power and control. So it's even more important for those in management positions than to acknowledge that they have power and control, but also be aware of how they exercise their power and control. So here's some items that are reflective of a professional. And I am calling us professionals, and I'm also calling us subject matter experts, SMEs, which is SME. And we're experts in what we do and how we do it. We have expert and specialized knowledge in our field of work. And we have excellent practical and literary skills. We have high quality of work and examples. We have high standards of professional ethics and behaviors. We have reasonable work and morale. Appropriate treatment of our relationship with colleagues. A professional is a master, and we're going to talk about this master category a little bit later. And a professional does mainly mental work, not physical work. So many times we're paid for sitting behind our desks, philosophizing about how we can change the world, doing a lot of intellectual, mental work. We do a lot of research, looking for best practices, looking for examples of other people who do things well. And so it's a lot of mental work. It's not like we work in factories or, you know, growing up, my dad and folks I knew did logging. It was very physical work. So it's not the kind of physical work that laborers do. So this diagram is reflective of our tribal coalition, who our members are, and how sometimes the boundaries get crossed. So ethics encompasses the personal, organizational, and corporate standards of behavior expected of professionals. And ethics is that branch of philosophy that talks about our beliefs about how people conduct themselves. So the relationship ethics is about how we treat others and how we're treated, and that relationship that we form with either those we work with or our peers. And most of the times our morals are beliefs that are based on tradition and practice. So it's not that we inherited a prescribed set of ethics. Those are usually built within our character over time. So it's good to know what our ethics are and what's expected by the organization in terms of ethics, professional standards, and how we're going to treat those we serve and how we treat each other. So professionals exercise specialist knowledge and skill, and how the use of this knowledge shall be governed when providing a service to the public can be considered a moral issue. So again, it's not something people force upon us, but it's something that we should give some thought to in how we approach our programming and how we deliver our services, how we're going to treat those people who are coming through our doors to access services, how we're going to treat each other, and how we're going to treat our peers out in the field. So in terms of our coalition in this diagram, we have members, and our members are tribal programs first. Sometimes if they don't have a tribal program, our members are tribes themselves. And then sometimes members are prior victims and now survivors. And so one of the things that I noticed coming into this work is many of the people who go into this type of work are survivors. And so they have that personal experience and that personal background that they bring to the workplace. It can be a double-edged sword if they haven't dealt with their own personal injuries coming into this kind of work, because this kind of work is very triggering in terms of bringing up memories and experiences, but can be valuable if the survivor has spent some time dealing with, you know, the behaviors and the acts that were committed against her or him. That can be helpful in having a degree of empathy in the work as well, and an understanding of the depth and the complications included in the work. So just in general, to have an ethical approach to your work, these are some of the standards that we should aspire to. Honesty, integrity, transparency, accountability, confidentiality, objectivity, respectfulness, obedience to the law, and loyalty. And I do want to say that within our work, we are held to a higher standard. We are considered the experts in our field, and so it is even more important that we identify our roles and our responsibilities within that. So a couple of the ways that we are regulated in our relationships and our relationships with others is via internal regulation or statutory regulation. Internal, from within, using the guidelines of the traditional and customary practices, using our own values and morals to guide us, versus a statutory regulation, which, in many cases is the rules and regulations say out of office on violence against women, or regulations from Department of Justice, or state mandated regulations. Most of us operate in an environment that includes both of those, that we do have to follow some law regulations that are set forth in local, state, federal law, but also we have some flexibility in terms of tapping in to ourselves in how we're going to behave and act in certain situations. So we have to take into account both internal and statutory regulations. So over the years, I've developed this employment strategy. And here's a little diagram that talks about that. So I know many times that when you work for tribes, you often take on positions and roles that you're not prepared to do. You're not prepared for. I have been in that situation before when I was hired, not having a clue about the job, or having to create the job once I got there. But in terms of being a manager and a supervisor, we do have some guidelines. And one of the first phases that we go through is during hire and orientation. And we want our employees to, before hire, have gone through an interview process that is well-defined, has set criteria, has scoring attached to their employment hiring, so that you can get the best applicant for the job. And in some cases, some of those statutory regulations require that we be able to show how the scoring and how an employee was hired. So those may be regulations that aren't coming just from us, they're coming from others outside of us that require that we do that. Orientation, I think every staff should have an orientation of the organization they're coming to work for. If it's a tribe, a tribal orientation. If you have a position that you're filling, certainly some kind of orientation, transference of duties is always nice, but always not possible. But some kind of orientation that grounds you in the expectations of the organization and gives you a good expectation of what's going to be required of you as you're filling that position. Once hired and going through the orientation, and you should be provided with policies and procedures and all of those things that we talked about earlier, an employment contract and all of that. Once all your paperwork is in order, then we move into the probationary stage. And many organizations have different time frames attached, 3 months, 6 months. I think a year is kind of long, but we have done 6 months before here, and now we do 3 months. And at the end of 3 months of employment, then you get a probationary evaluation. And that's basically an evaluation that reflects upon your capabilities to do the job that you were hired to do. So the question becomes for supervisors, as we're doing evaluations, what is it are we evaluating? Are we evaluating the inputs, or are we evaluating the outcomes? So just to reflect on that. Are you interested in how much effort the employee is doing? Are you actually interested in the final products, the quality of the final products? Once we go from probationary evaluation, and assuming that they have passed the probationary period, then we move into learning and mastery. In my timeline for this has always been a year. So in my mind, I give people a year to learn about the organization, learn about their jobs, and to master it. And I stick pretty closely to position descriptions. And so phase 3 for me is about a year. And then after that, we should be moving into proficiency and initiative. And in this phase, the employee should know their job well, should be taking some initiative in improving things around them, and maybe 2+ years down the road be ready for some kind of additional advancement or additional taking on of duties. So just consider the different phases as you look at those you supervise and those you're responsible for, and think about those different stages and how you're going to do that. So this is an example of our organizational chart here at WomenSpirit. And every organization or program should have an organizational chart. It's good to know internally and externally as you share it with others about the efficiency of your program. And on an annual basis, you should review your position descriptions, update your policy and procedures as needed, and then once you have them, for sure, follow them. Answers to any situation should be evident and answerable within your program and agency documents, and the documents should be accessible to everyone. So another little chart on employment proficiency. You can kind of fill in the blanks yourself. In the beginning, you have an enthusiastic beginner who has high commitment but may have low competence. And then they may move into a disillusioned learner who may have low competence or low commitment, but a growing competence level. And then a capable but cautious performer who has both growing commitment and growing competence. And then the final stage is a self-reliant achiever who has high commitment and high competence. So over time, your employees should be developing, and you should be able to track both their commitment level and their competency levels. So 5 ways to set up your people for success. Start with a game plan discussion. Collaborate on goal setting. Make sure goals are SMART. Properly diagnose the development level for the goal and help them get an A. So all of our efforts should be made toward helping people succeed at their work. And if they're not succeeding, then we need to get a game plan going so that everyone is successful. So SMART. SMART is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So specific. The objective should be precise and well-defined so that everyone can understand the results or the end product of the work to be done. It shouldn't be a surprise or a mystery what you expect of employees. Measurable. The objective should have a measurable component that defines how everyone will know when the objective has been completed. The objective should be defined using specific terms such as quantity, quality, frequency, cost, deadlines, etc. Attainable. The objective should be within the organization's resource capabilities. Can it be done in the given time frame, opportunity, and with resources available? Realistic. The objective should be one that fits into the current business environment and be possible for the individual or individuals to achieve. And time-bound. The objective should be work that is appropriate to do now and is achievable within a specific time frame. The objective should have a concrete deadline. So something to keep in mind about when we're defining the scope of work for our employees. Also for ourselves, oftentimes as executives, we may not have anybody doing this for us, but this is an exercise that we should do on our own behalf to make sure that we're doing our best work as well. So what happens when boundaries are crossed? What informal and formal tools do you have if boundaries or ethics are violated? And so as supervisors, managers, directors, we should always do supervision sessions. I like doing these before things get derailed because then you're in a proactive and positive movement forward instead of a negative. If necessary, then you can think about corrective action processes if things aren't happening moving forward. Always document. Worst case scenario is termination. And always, what does your employee handbook say about the different stages? It should be listed in your employee policies and procedures, you know, often with dates and times attached so that an employee knows exactly what the agency process is. I want to skip over to talking about board member responsibilities and policies for a minute. Because if you are operating a nonprofit, and I would hope that even some of these practices could be applied to tribal councils for people that are in positions of authority that have people working under them, that some of these best practices would apply to tribal council members as well. So there are some documents where you can find the governing policies that refer to boundaries, limits, standards, and practices that are required by law. And when you're a nonprofit, these are found in your bylaws and forming documents. Your every board or council should have governing policies regarding finance, conflict of interest, travel, compensation, and contract procurement, just to talk about a few. So one of the things that I was always told that contracts are written, yes, but also what you say verbally can be held up to the same standard as a written contract. So you have written and verbal agreements that are binding. So in our positions as directors, managers, and supervisors, it's important to be aware of any kinds of promises you're making, and just be aware of your language, because for the organization that could be considered a contract, and we would be have to uphold it and honor that contract. So this is the contact information here, and I do